I've always known Willow was special. From the moment she arrived at Tranquility Farm, her cleverness stood out, a gift that brought both pride and chaos. But when her fame drew the wrong kind of attention, I nearly lost her forever. This is the story of how I fought to bring her home, the lessons she taught me, and the unbreakable bond between us. Willow isn't just a horse, she's family. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The first light of dawn broke over Tranquility Farm as I stepped out of the house, coffee steaming in my hand. This was my time of peace, when the world was quiet except for the soft nickering of the horses and the rhythmic chirping of crickets fading into the morning. Every day started like this, and every day it reminded me why I loved this life. I adjusted my hat and made my way toward the stables. The air smelled fresh, a mix of dew-covered grass and the earthy scent of hay. But something felt different. It wasn't the usual serene anticipation. My steps quickened as I neared the barn, and then I saw it. The stable doors were wide open, swinging lazily in the morning breeze. My stomach twisted. I always double-check those doors before turning in for the night. It's second nature after years of doing this. Yet there they were, flung open like I'd never touched them. The scene inside the barn didn't help ease my nerves. Hay was strewn everywhere, buckets knocked over, and several stalls were empty. My heart raced as I scanned the area. "Where are you, Willow?" I called, my voice cracking with urgency. It didn't take long to spot her. There she was, standing just outside her stall, her chestnut coat glistening in the soft light of dawn. She turned to look at me, her big, intelligent eyes sparkling with something that resembled mischief. "Willow," I sighed, a mix of exasperation and relief flooding through me. "What are you up to this time?" Willow wasn't like the other horses. She was sharp, too sharp sometimes. It wasn't the first time she'd caused a bit of chaos around here, but this felt different. I had locked her stall. I was sure of it. I stepped closer, running a hand along her neck to calm myself as much as her. "What are we going to do with you, huh?" She nickered softly, leaning into my touch like she didn't have a care in the world. I turned my attention to rounding up the others. Several of them had wandered out toward the paddock, trotting lazily through the grass. It took some time, but I finally got them back in their stalls. My movements were automatic, closing latches, tossing hay, checking water troughs, but my mind churned with questions. Had I really left the doors unlocked? It didn't seem possible. I'd been doing this long enough to know better. But if I hadn't forgotten, then what? Willow nudged me again, this time more insistently. She had that look in her eye, the one that always made me feel like she knew more than she let on. I chuckled despite myself, scratching behind her ear. "You're not going to tell me what happened, are you?" I muttered. Her soft whinny was the only answer I got. Once the barn was back in order, I leaned against the doorframe and surveyed the scene. The farm was waking up now, sunlight spilling over the fields, but the unease in my chest didn't fade. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't let it happen again. I resolved to get to the bottom of it. Whatever or whoever was behind this, I was going to find out. I couldn't stop thinking about that morning. By the time the sun was high, I had cleaned up the barn and gone through every latch and door twice. Still, the question burned in my mind. How had this happened? That evening, as the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the hills, I grabbed a small camera from the house and headed back to the barn. It was a simple, discreet device, a precaution we used to monitor the fields during calving season, but tonight it would serve a new purpose. As I set it up near Willow's stall, I felt a twinge of guilt. "This isn't about not trusting you," I muttered under my breath, glancing at her as she stood in her stall, calmly chewing on a mouthful of hay. "I just need to know what's going on here." Willow flicked her ears, her gaze steady and unbothered. It was like she could tell I was talking to her. I secured the camera and made sure it was angled to catch every corner of the barn. If anyone or anything was responsible for last night's chaos, I'd know by morning. The next morning, I woke before dawn, eager and uneasy to check the footage. The barn was quiet, just as I had left it, but the memory of those open doors wouldn't let me rest. Back in the house, I set the camera down on the kitchen table and plugged it into the laptop. As the screen flickered to life, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The first few hours of the recording were uneventful. Shadows shifted as the moon rose higher. The horses shifted in their stalls, and the barn creaked softly in the wind. But then, around 3 a.m, movement caught my eye. There she was, Willow. At first, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. She stood in her stall, occasionally nuzzling the hay scattered on the floor. But then, she stepped closer to the latch on her door, tilting her head as if studying it. "What are you doing, girl?" I muttered, leaning in closer to the screen. With precision that made my jaw drop, Willow stretched her neck and began working the latch with her teeth. Her movements were slow but deliberate, her muzzle nudging and pulling until the latch clicked open. She gave the door a gentle push with her head and stepped out into the barn like it was the most natural thing in the world. I sat back, staring at the screen in disbelief. "No way," I whispered. But she didn't stop there. Willow trotted over to the next stall, where another horse waited. Using the same technique, she unlatched that door too. Within minutes, 3 more horses were loose, following Willow into the yard like she was their leader. The footage ended with the horses wandering around the paddock, their silhouettes dark against the early morning light. I replayed the clip twice, trying to process what I'd seen. This wasn't some fluke or accident. Willow knew exactly what she was doing. By mid-morning, I was back in the barn, watching her like she might sprout wings next. She stood in her stall, calm as ever, her ears flicking as I approached. "Willow," I said softly, stepping closer. "You're not just smart, you're brilliant. Too brilliant for your own good." She nickered, leaning her head over the stall door, as if to say, "Of course I am." I ran a hand down her neck, my thoughts racing. This wasn't just a clever trick, it was a problem. If Willow could let herself and the others out whenever she pleased, how long before it caused real trouble? What if they wandered into the road? Or worse? My mind flashed back to the first day I met her. She'd been just a foal, all legs and curiosity, nudging her way into everything. She had this spark, even then an intelligence that made her stand out. I'd always admired it, but now, for the first time, it felt like a double-edged sword. I decided not to tell Sophie and George about the footage just yet. I needed to think this through. What could I do to keep Willow safe while still letting her be herself? That evening, as the sky turned a dusky orange, I sat on a bale of hay, watching her. Willow nudged at the door with her muzzle, testing it like she always did. She didn't seem frustrated by the new lock I'd added earlier in the day, more curious, like it was just another puzzle to solve. "You're going to keep me on my toes, aren't you?" I asked aloud. She snorted softly, her head tilting in that way that always made me feel like she understood every word. I sighed, leaning back against the barn wall. Whatever was happening here, I couldn't deny it anymore. Willow was special. But special came with responsibilities, and I wasn't about to let her brilliance put her in harm's way. As I locked the barn that night, triple-checking every latch, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I was still running on the shock of Willow's midnight escape routine. I couldn't shake the image of her working that latch like a seasoned locksmith. I had to tell someone, so I grabbed my phone and texted Sophie. "You're not going to believe this. Willow can open her own stall. And the others. I have it on video." Sophie's response came instantly. "You have to show me. This I've got to see." Later that day, Sophie stopped by the barn. I played the footage for her on my laptop, watching her reaction carefully. Her jaw dropped, her hand flying to her mouth as she burst into laughter. "She's a genius," Sophie exclaimed, doubling over. "Noah, this is incredible." I tried to laugh along, but my unease lingered. "It's impressive, sure, but it's also dangerous. What if they got hurt? What if someone—" "Oh, relax," Sophie interrupted, waving me off. "This is harmless. People are going to love this." Before I could protest, she pulled out her phone and filmed the screen, narrating her excitement as she captured the clip. We have to share this, Noah. People need to see how smart Willow is. By that evening, the video was online. I didn't think much of it at first. Sophie had a small circle of friends who loved animal stories, and I figured it would stay there. But by the time I checked my phone the next morning, my notifications were blowing up. 2 million views? I muttered, scrolling through the endless comments. How? The video had taken off overnight. People were calling Willow the Houdini horse and a four-legged genius. The clip had been shared by major animal pages, and it felt like every hour brought another 1,000 views. I should have been happy, proud even. Willow deserved recognition for how special she was. But as I stood in the barn that morning, feeling the usual peace of the farm slipping away, I couldn't help but worry. By the end of the week, Tranquility Farm was overrun. Cars lined the dirt road, and the front gate had to be propped open to accommodate the steady stream of visitors. Families with kids, reporters with cameras, and even a handful of YouTubers crowded around the paddock, all asking the same question. Where's Willow? Sophie loved the attention. George, her husband, set up a donation jar near the barn entrance, grinning as kids dropped coins and bills in exchange for photos. It was good for the farm, they said. But every time I saw someone pointing a camera at Willow, my stomach churned. She didn't seem to mind at first. Willow was as curious as ever, nuzzling at cameras and basking in the attention. But by the third day, I noticed her behavior change. She started pacing her stall, her ears flicking nervously as the noise outside grew louder. That evening, after the last visitor left, I found her in her stall, staring out at the empty barn like she was trying to make sense of it all. I leaned against the door, running a hand through my hair. You okay, girl? I asked softly. She turned to me, her eyes reflecting the dim barn light. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the hay trough, letting the silence settle between us. I don't know about all this, I admitted. You're amazing, Willow. The smartest horse I've ever met. But all these people? It's not what we're about, is it? She nickered softly, stepping closer to rest her muzzle on my shoulder. The gesture was so simple, so familiar, that it nearly broke me. I'll figure out, I said, my voice firm despite the knot in my throat. We'll get through this. I promise. The next day, the unease I'd felt turned to outright suspicion. A man I didn't recognize lingered by Willow's stall longer than the others, his gaze darting around the barn like he was sizing it up. When I approached, he gave me a nervous smile and asked, "What time do you close up around here?" His tone was casual, but the question sent chills down my spine. I forced a smile, keeping my voice steady. "We're pretty secure," I said, motioning toward the reinforced locks on the stall doors. "We keep a close eye on things." The man nodded and walked away, but the encounter left me rattled. That night, I doubled up on security. I added an extra lock to Willow's stall and made sure every door and window in the barn was shut tight. As I walked back to the house, I looked over my shoulder at the darkened barn. Something was coming, I could feel it. And I wasn't about to let anyone, or anything, hurt Willow. The barn was still when I walked in that night. Too still. The horses were quiet, their soft breaths the only sound in the dim light of the lantern I carried. The new locks I had installed glinted in the darkness, a small reassurance that everything was secure. I stayed in the barn longer than usual, double-checking each stall door. When I reached Willow's, she turned her head to look at me, her dark eyes full of that quiet intelligence that had become both a gift and a worry. "You're safe tonight, girl," I whispered, brushing a hand along her neck. She snorted softly, leaning into my touch. It was moments like this that reminded me why I loved this life, even when it came with its share of chaos. After triple-checking every latch and securing the barn doors, I headed back to the house. I kept my phone close, ready to check the cameras if I heard so much as a creak in the night. When I woke up the next morning, it wasn't the usual peaceful hum of the farm. It was silence. Dead, heavy silence. My gut twisted as I threw on my boots and bolted out the door. The barn doors were open. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The locks I'd installed lay on the ground, broken and twisted like they'd been torn off with brute force. "No," I whispered, rushing inside. The stalls were empty. I ran from stall to stall, calling out their names, hoping against hope that I was wrong. When I reached Willow's, my knees nearly gave out. Her stall was wide open, the hay scattered, her halter missing. "Willow!" I yelled, sprinting out of the barn and into the paddock. My eyes darted over the fields, searching for any sign of her. The other horses, the dark shape of a mane moving against the morning fog, anything. But the fields were empty. My chest tightened and panic clawed at my throat. I stumbled back to the barn and grabbed my phone. The footage. I had to check the cameras. My fingers fumbled as I rewound the recording, eyes glued to the screen. Around midnight, the footage showed the barn in darkness. Then, headlights flashed in the distance, and a black van pulled up quietly. Figures emerged from the van, 4 of them. They moved fast, prying the locks open with tools and leading the horses out one by one. My heart sank as I saw them pull Willow from her stall, her head held high despite the rope they used to guide her. The van drove off minutes later, the taillights disappearing into the night. I stared at the screen, my fists clenching. The next hours passed in a blur. I called Sophie and George, then the police, and soon enough, the farm was swarming with officers. They examined the broken locks, took prints, and asked me questions I barely processed. "You're sure the van was black?" one officer asked, jotting notes. "Yes," I said, my voice strained. "Part of the license plate was visible too. K9T, or something close to that." "We'll track it," the officer assured me. But the hollow tone in his voice wasn't exactly encouraging. The guilt hit me hardest that afternoon. I sat on the edge of Willow's empty stall, my hands trembling. "I should have done more," I muttered, my voice breaking. "I should have stayed in the barn. I should have, but I hadn't." And now she was gone. Memories of Willow flooded my mind, her first days at the farm as a curious, playful foal. The way she used to nuzzle me whenever I brought her favorite apple treats, the sparkle in her eyes when she figured out a new trick. I felt the knot in my chest tighten. This wasn't just about a horse. Willow was family, and I had failed her. The police called later that evening. They tracked a van matching the description to a remote property on the outskirts of town. "You coming with us?" the officer asked. I didn't hesitate. "Yes." The drive out to the property was tense, every mile stretching like an eternity. My mind raced with questions. Was she safe? Was she scared? Would I ever see her again? When we arrived, the officers spread out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I followed, my heart pounding in my ears. Inside the barn, the air was damp and musty. The sound of hooves shuffling drew my attention, and I turned to see her. Willow. She stood in a corner, her head low but her eyes alert. The moment our eyes met, she nickered softly, and I felt tears sting my eyes. "Willow," I whispered, rushing to her side. I wrapped my arms around her neck, ignoring the dirt and the smell. She leaned into me, her warmth a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. "It's okay, girl," I murmured. "I'm here. I've got you now." The officers rounded up the other horses and arrested the rustlers, who claimed they didn't know the horses were stolen. Their lies only deepened my anger, but I forced myself to focus on Willow. She was what mattered. The ride back to Tranquility Farm was quiet, but my hand never left Willow's halter. I talked to her softly, promising her over and over that she was safe now, that this would never happen again. When we got home, the other horses welcomed her with soft nickers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I breathed easier. As I watched her settle into her stall, exhaustion hit me like a wave, but I couldn't leave. I sat by her door, my head resting against the wood, and whispered, "You're home, girl. You're finally home." The barn was silent when we returned, the soft crunch of gravel under the truck's tires the only sound. I kept my hand on Willow's halter, gently stroking her neck as the officers opened the trailer doors. She stepped down carefully, her ears twitching as she took in her surroundings. "You're home now," I whispered, my voice hoarse from the day's events. The other horses greeted her with soft nickers as I led her back to her stall. For a moment, the world seemed to breathe again. The knot in my chest loosened, but it didn't go away. As I latched her stall, making sure every bolt was secure, I felt a new kind of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Willow leaned her head over the door, her soft eyes meeting mine. Despite everything, there was trust in that gaze, an unspoken belief that I'd keep her safe. "I won't let you down again," I said firmly. "I promise." The next morning, the farm came alive with the news. Neighbors and friends poured in, relief and joy on their faces. Sophie and George bustled around, sharing updates and accepting hugs, but I stayed near Willow's stall, my focus on her. "She's a fighter, isn't she?" one neighbor said, peering over the door. "She always has been," I replied, stroking Willow's mane. As the morning wore on, I noticed small changes in Willow. She wasn't as restless as she'd been during the days of the visitors. She seemed calmer, her movements more relaxed. It was as if being back on the farm had restored a part of her. But the experience had changed me. That night, I sat in the barn long after everyone had gone home. The air was warm and quiet, the kind of stillness that let you think. Willow stood in her stall, watching me as I worked. "You know," I said, leaning against the door, "you've always been a handful. Even when you were full. Remember when you figured out how to open the tack room?" She snorted softly, almost like she did remember. I let out a small laugh, but it faded quickly. "I was so proud of you back then." "I still am. But this?" I gestured to the barn around us. "This was too close. I can't let it happen again." Her ears flicked toward me, and she stepped closer, resting her muzzle on my shoulder. It was a gesture so simple, so full of trust, that it nearly undid me. The next day, the officers stopped by to go over the arrests. 2 of the rustlers had claimed they thought the horses were legally purchased, but the evidence said otherwise. "They've been part of an operation targeting farms like yours," one officer explained. "They scout out high-value animals, especially ones that draw attention." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. Willow's fame, the thing that had made her special, had almost cost her everything. "They'll face charges," he continued. "But it's a reminder to stay vigilant. Fame has its risks." As I watched the officer leave, I felt a mixture of anger and guilt. Fame wasn't her fault. She was just being herself. But I'd let the attention get out of hand, and it had made her a target. That evening, I installed reinforced locks on every stall. I checked the cameras, added a new motion detector, and even repositioned the lights outside the barn. It wasn't paranoia, it was necessity. Willow watched me as I worked, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to my racing thoughts. "I'm sorry, girl," I said quietly, "for letting this happen, for putting you at risk." She stepped closer, nudging me gently, and I smiled despite myself. "You forgive me, don't you?" I whispered. Her soft nicker was all the answer I needed. As the sun set over Tranquility Farm, I leaned against the fence, watching Willow graze in the paddock. She moved with the same grace she always had, her tail swishing lazily as she enjoyed the quiet evening. In that moment, I realized something important. Willow wasn't just resilient, she was a survivor. Her spirit hadn't been broken, not by the theft, the strangers, or the ordeal. She'd come through it all stronger, and that gave me hope. "She's something special," Sophie said, joining me at the fence. "She always has been," I replied. Sophie looked at me, her expression soft. "You did good, Noah. You brought her home." I nodded, my gaze never leaving Willow. "I just want to make sure she stays safe." "We all do," Sophie said, patting my shoulder. As the stars began to appear, I headed back to the barn for one final check. The locks were secure, the cameras were recording, and the barn was quiet. Willow turned her head as I approached, her ears perking up. I leaned against her stall door, letting out a long breath. "Good night, girl," I said softly. "Rest easy. You're safe now." She blinked at me, her gaze steady and calm, and for the first time in days, I felt the same way. The barn buzzed with life the next morning. Neighbors dropped by to check on Willow and the other horses, their smiles warm with relief. The farm had never felt so alive, yet all I wanted was a moment of quiet with Willow. I stayed near her stall, brushing her coat, while the others mingled and talked. She stood still, her tail swishing softly as I worked, her calmness anchoring me. "You've got a fan club now, you know that?" I muttered with a small smile. She nickered in response, leaning into the brush strokes like nothing had changed. But things had changed for both of us. As the last visitor left, the farm settled into a quieter rhythm. I led Willow to the paddock, watching her graze under the mid-morning sun. She moved with the same grace she always had, her spirit intact despite everything she'd been through. George joined me by the fence, leaning on the wooden rails. "She seems okay," he said, nodding toward Willow. "She's tougher than I am," I admitted, my voice tinged with both admiration and guilt. "You can't blame yourself, Noah," George said firmly. "You did everything you could." I wanted to believe him, but the memory of those open barn doors and Willow's empty stall was still fresh in my mind. I just wish I'd seen it coming. George clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You brought her home. That's what matters." I nodded, watching as Willow lifted her head, her ears flicking toward the sound of birds in the distance. That evening, I sat in the barn long after the sun had set. The horses were quiet, their soft breaths filling the space. Willow was in her stall, chewing on a bit of hay, her eyes calm and steady as they met mine. "You've always been special," I said, my voice low. "Even when you were just a foal, you had that spark." She stepped closer, her muzzle brushing against my arm. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried a weight that I couldn't quite put into words. I thought back to all the moments she'd amazed me. The first time she figured out how to open the tack room door, the way she'd lead the other horses with such confidence. Her cleverness had always been a source of pride, but now it felt like a responsibility I hadn't fully appreciated until now. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the farm, checking every lock, every gate, and every fence line. It wasn't just about preventing another theft. It was about honoring the trust Willow placed in me. Sophie and George were working on a new visitor policy, one that would limit access to the barn and paddock. The attention Willow had brought to Tranquility Farm was a blessing in many ways, but it came with risks we couldn't ignore. That evening, I watched Willow from the porch, the golden light of sunset casting a warm glow over her chestnut coat. She was grazing near the fence, her movements unhurried and serene. "You're home, girl," I said softly, more to myself than to her. "And I'll make sure it stays that way." The barn buzzed with life the next morning. Neighbors dropped by to check on Willow and the other horses, their smiles warm with relief. The farm had never felt so alive, yet all I wanted was a moment of quiet with Willow. I stayed near her stall, brushing her coat while the others mingled and talked. She stood still, her tail swishing softly as I worked, her calmness anchoring me. "You've got a fan club now, you know that?" I muttered with a small smile. She nickered in response, leaning into the brush strokes like nothing had changed. But things had changed for both of us. As the last visitor left, the farm settled into a quieter rhythm. I led Willow to the paddock, watching her graze under the mid-morning sun. She moved with the same grace she always had, her spirit intact despite everything she'd been through. George joined me by the fence, leaning on the wooden rails. "She seems okay," he said, nodding toward Willow. "She's tougher than I am," I admitted, my voice tinged with both admiration and guilt. "You can't blame yourself, Noah," George said firmly. "You did everything you could." I wanted to believe him, but the memory of those open barn doors and Willow's empty stall was still fresh in my mind. I just wish I'd seen it coming. George clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You brought her home. That's what matters." I nodded, watching as Willow lifted her head, her ears flicking toward the sound of birds in the distance. That evening, I sat in the barn long after the sun had set. The horses were quiet, their soft breaths filling the space. Willow was in her stall, chewing on a bit of hay, her eyes calm and steady as they met mine. "You've always been special," I said, my voice low. "Even when you were just a foal, you had that spark." She stepped closer, her muzzle brushing against my arm. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried a weight that I couldn't quite put into words. I thought back to all the moments she'd amazed me. The first time she figured out how to open the tack room door, the way she'd lead the other horses with such confidence. Her cleverness had always been a source of pride, but now it felt like a responsibility I hadn't fully appreciated until now. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the farm, checking every lock, every gate, and every fence line. It wasn't just about preventing another theft. It was about honoring the trust Willow placed in me. Sophie and George were working on a new visitor policy, one that would limit access to the barn and paddock. The attention Willow had brought to Tranquility Farm was a blessing in many ways, but it came with risks we couldn't ignore. That evening, I watched Willow from the porch, the golden light of sunset casting a warm glow over her chestnut coat. She was grazing near the fence, her movements unhurried and serene. "You're home, girl," I said softly, more to myself than to her. "And I'll make sure it stays that way." The farm was quiet that night, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the horses in the paddock. Willow stood near the fence, her chestnut coat gleaming in the soft light. She looked so calm, so at home. For the first time in weeks, I felt the same. A lot had changed since that night, since the theft. The barn was more secure now, with reinforced locks, motion detectors, and new cameras. Sophie and George had cut back on visitors, allowing the farm to return to the peaceful rhythm that had made it special in the first place. But the biggest change wasn't in the farm. It was in me. As the coffee cooled in my hands, I let my thoughts drift. Willow had always been different. I remembered the day she arrived, a scrawny, curious foal who couldn't stop nosing around her stall. Even back then, she had a spark, an intelligence that set her apart. I'd loved that about her. But I hadn't realized how much it meant until I nearly lost her. Looking back, I understood now that protecting her wasn't just about locks and cameras. It was about balance, about making sure her cleverness was celebrated, not stifled. She deserved the chance to thrive, to be herself, even if it meant taking on a little more responsibility. I stood up, setting my cup on the porch railing. The night air was cool as I walked toward the paddock, the sound of my boots crunching softly on the gravel. Willow noticed me right away, her ears flicking toward the sound of my steps. She lifted her head, a strand of hay still dangling from her mouth, and nickered softly. "Hey, girl," I said, leaning against the fence. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" She stepped closer, her dark eyes meeting mine. There was something so steady in her gaze, something that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to bring her back. I reached out, running my hand along her neck. "You've taught me a lot, you know," I said quietly. "About trust. About responsibility. About what it means to really care for someone." She nuzzled my arm, and I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. As I watched her, a thought crossed my mind. Willow wasn't just a horse. She was a reminder, a symbol of resilience, of intelligence, of the bond between us that went beyond words. She'd been through so much, but here she was, stronger than ever. "I'll keep you safe," I promised. "But I won't stop you from being who you are. That's what makes you special." Willow flicked her tail, her gaze calm and steady, and I felt a weight lift from my chest. As I headed back toward the house, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. Willow was still there, her silhouette outlined against the moonlit fields. She was home. And so was I.